Yes, this is wildlife biologist Eric Orff from New Hampshire Fish and Wildlife. Today is July 15th, 2019. Well, today's video I'm going to call Bear, Moose, Goose, Fisher, Fox, Pheasants. You know, I've lived here in Epsom, actually, as of last weekend or 2 weekends ago, 40 years. I've lived in Epsom 40 years, and during that time, my career, most of my career, was with the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department as a wildlife biologist. So I was just thinking the other day of the guests that I had right here in my home in Epsom. Yes, bear, moose, goose, fisher, fox, pheasants, and more. I've had lots of animals that I've brought home, usually on a temporary basis, some for longer stays. For instance, bears, black bears. I was the black bear biologist beginning in 1978. So I've had adult bears that I've had to capture elsewhere in the state, and maybe it was late in the day, so I would bring them here overnight and then take them someplace the next day to released. One yearling bear I had here for just a night or so. Took it to a neighbor who actually rehabilitated that bear and raised it for me. Cubs, bear cubs. I've had a number of bear cubs here for at least a short period of time till I could get them to someone that could take long-term care of them. Fisher, wow. I've had almost 200 fisher here at the house. In the early 1990s, the state of Connecticut, the fur bearer biologist there asked if I could help translocate some fisher from New Hampshire to restock or restore the population in Connecticut. In the early 1990s, I, over a period, I think of 2 years, transferred about 20 fisher to Connecticut. All of those came through my home. Then in 1994, Pennsylvania wanted to restore fisher, where they were actually extinct there for over 100 years. So between 1994, 1995, and 96, I actually brought 175 fisher to my home here overnight because I had to have them at the Manchester airport at 3:45 the next morning. So in the month of December is fisher trapping season here in New Hampshire. The trappers caught them live in live cages. I would go during the day, pick the live fisher up and put them in these plastic tubes and hold them here overnight, put an apple in there for some moisture and food. And the next morning I would have them at the Manchester airport, the cargo, at 3:45 in the morning. And by noon they would be down at Penn State. So fisher. Pheasants, well, pheasants are stocked here each fall for the hunters. But come late December, sometimes pheasants would show up at the fishing game headquarters in Concord, and I would bring them home and put them in a cage and raise them through the winter and release them in the spring. So back in the 80s and late 70s and 80s, there were not very many wildlife rehabilitators in the state. These are people who are licensed to actually take care of orphaned or injured animals until they can hopefully be released into the wild. So before a lot of those were around, staff had to bring some of these animals home to take care of them until they could be placed with somebody else. So I have had bear cubs, bear adults, and fisher in numbers. Another animal here that I actually translocated, I had several live otters here at my house. Actually, when I built my garage in 1985, I put in a grease pit so I could change my own oil. And lo and behold, Pennsylvania wanted otter. That was in the early 90s. So I would work with trappers and get live otter. I think only 2 or 3 during the winter. And I actually cleaned out my grease pit because they couldn't take them right off in Pennsylvania. And I kept the otter for probably a month in my grease pit or in my garage, and I would go to the hatchery and pick up some fresh fish and feed the otter right here. So I had otters for a long time. The mink that I got was not doing well, and actually I remember having the mink. I kept a cage in my basement, and I had the mink in my basement for quite a while, as was the goose. I got a sickly goose one fall and put him down in my basement and fed and cared for him until he finally got better, maybe by the spring, and released the pheasant. A possum, I had a long-term resident here with an opossum one winter. Opossums often in New Hampshire, because we're on the northern part of the range, their toes will be frostbit, their ears will be all blackened and frostbit, and their tails. Well, this opossum came to me, and there again, I put a cage in my basement, and I kept the opossum through the winter. And I remember come spring, I actually took it to the Epsom Central School. My daughter, I think, was in maybe 3rd or 4th grade, and I took the opossum in. They're easy to handle, even though they're wild animals, and took them into the school and talked about animals. And then as the kids were getting ready to head out to recess, I stood by the door with the opossum. And of course, possums have prehensile tails, so the students would touch his tail and he would curl his tail around their finger. So they all got to, as those who wanted, got to touch the opossum. Bats, well, I had dozens of bats here that I again caught in the wintertime and try to hold them till spring. Deer, I remember having a couple of deer here, one or two adults, and a couple of fawns that were transferred to the University of Hampshire where they were holding them. I live about 1.5 miles from Bear Brook State Park. It's a 10,000 acre park here in the state, the 2nd largest in the state. So the moose that stayed here for a brief period of time were basically in transit down to Bear Brook, where I released them, as was the deer as well. Birds, I've had a few other birds, again, that I just held briefly till I could find a long-term care for these small birds. Raccoons, I had 3 or 4 in a cage. Oh, and they were too young, but they were eating, so I fed them and kept them for a month or more in a cage till they were old enough to be released. Now, another thing I actually had here were fish. There was a time that the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department were stocking Atlantic salmon in the state to try to restore the population, and John Greenwood was leading that program, and I said, well, you know, we should put some in the Suncook River. So he would have me go up to the Warren hatchery and pick up, I don't know, 50,000 or 100,000 Atlantic salmon fry. They were only about this long, about 1.5 inches long, and I would bring them home here and arrange for volunteers to help me stock them in the Suncook River and its tributaries. So yes, I have had the fortune of having lots of animals here at my home in Epsom. So bear, moose, goose, fisher, fox, and pheasants. I've had them all right here as I've lived here in Epsom for 40 years. A lot of nice guests.